We've already been talking a little bit already, but I'm Rachel Collins. I direct the first year writing program at Arcadia University. And Willow, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure, I'm Willow DiPasquale, and I teach in the first year writing program at Arcadia with Rachel.
And I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Please let me know if the screen share does not seem to be coming through. I assume everyone is looking at my screen now. So we want to start, and you can still see it? Okay, good. We want to start by mentioning some of the conditions under which we are working and the perspective from which we're coming to you today to talk about alternative grading as a language equity practice. Arcadia University is a small liberal arts school in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We have about 2,000 undergraduate students, and we are a predominantly white institution. In terms of context for how contract grading is situated in our first year writing program, the history here is that after George Floyd's murder in May of 2020, our university, like many others, began a process of self-examination. And efforts were made to identify and dismantle the ways in which our institution had been long complicit in racist practices. So one form that this has taken is for English 101, our required first year writing course for all students. For English 101 to be revised such that not only does it do the first year writing things that it's always done, but it also serves as a first year foundation for our students in anti-racism, the vocabulary of racial literacy, things like that. And so for the past 2 years, Willow and I have been working to revise the English 101 curriculum. And in doing so, we've been focusing on 3 different dimensions. This is a view from 10,000 feet here. We've thought a lot about intellectual content, right? So we've introduced paper topics and readings focused on anti-racism throughout the semester. We have thought a lot about classroom pedagogy, and this has meant training our faculty in anti-racist and inclusive pedagogies. We've done a lot of training and a lot of sort of teaching learning circles and things like that. And number 3, assessment practices, which is the reason that we're here today, right? We've adopted contract grading as a language equity practice across all sections in the first year writing program. And that's one of the things we think is kind of unique about what we're doing. It's just this year that we have been rolling this out for the first time. So the data we're going to present today and the feedback from students we're going to share with you is all from the first year of the rollout of contract grading across the entire program. But because the entire writing program is using contract grading now, not just the 2 of us as individuals, I think that's one of the things that makes the data we'll share with you today pretty unique. I don't know that there are many other data sets out there like this that reflect student responses and student experiences in contract grading across 16 plus sections taught by a dozen different faculty members. So that's a sort of overview of where we're coming from. And I think this might be a good moment to pause. Willow, what are some of the themes we're seeing in terms of familiarity levels from our participants?
Yeah, so it looks like the majority of folks in our session are either not familiar or familiar and interested, and then a small number have actually implemented this in their own classrooms. It looks like maybe 3 or 4 of you have done it either a lot and for a while or just starting to do it. And then many of you are expressing a lot of warm interest, wanting to learn, and a lot of you mentioning, wanting to make teaching more equitable and thinking of contract grading as a way to make your teaching a little bit more equitable or anti-racist or something along those lines.
Great. I should say that I've somehow managed to get my screens set up such that I'm not seeing the chat. So if things are coming up in the chat and I seem like I am just blowing right by them, please interrupt and draw my attention to them. Okay, so we'll dive back into the workshop now. And Okay, so we want to start with a few words about why and how we identified contract grading as an essential element of our writing program's anti-racist liberatory practice. Our approach has been shaped by Dr. Vey's research on linguistic justice, and we want to share what is kind of a long passage with you right now, because it really sets up some key issues for how we have been thinking about this. So I'm literally going to read this quote. So Dr. Vey says, "One of the feats I routinely witness as I speak to teachers and tutors across the nation is this. Teachers say that they recognize the importance of language diversity for students, but they tell their students that they have to get ready for the teacher in the next class who will prejudge them, or to the employer who won't hire them if they don't speak or write a certain way." And I should say, there was a conversation in the chat about this very issue in the previous session with the student panel that I just think is really relevant. So he goes on to say, the feat here is that teachers want to present themselves as anti-racist, while at the same time, they are the ones enacting the very prejudice on the student that they say the student will experience outside. In other words, the teacher's saying, I'm not racist, but I'm going to teach you in a way, in other words, how to switch off your black, and grade in a way that is down, if you're black in your writing, that will prepare you to be acceptable to the folks who are really racist. The teacher then becomes the stand-in, the proxy for the would-be racist. Now that's a feat, to contort oneself into being an anti-racist and a surrogate stand-in racist at the same time, to be both simultaneously a promoter of linguistic diversity and operate against it. So this is an unethical and an untenable position for faculty who are committed to anti-racism and language equity to be in, right? So we grappled with the question, how can we make sure our faculty and our students are not in the situation that Dr. Vey describes here? And this is how we began to explore contract grading as a language equity practice. The troubling dynamic that Dr. Vey is describing here is rooted in what Asao Inui calls a white racial habitus, in which whitely assumptions and values are positioned as markers of quality and correctness in the grading system. And this too is obviously deeply problematic. So we've adopted a version of contract grading that's inspired by Inui's work on labor-based contract grading. Inui focuses on what he calls labor, right? Hours and minutes and time that students are putting in. We've adjusted this focus slightly. We tend to call it process-based contract grading in order to emphasize engagement with the recursive process of revision. Before going any further, I think we want to stop and tell you a little bit about what contract grading looks like in our program. So we assume that there's great diversity in terms of how much these bullet points will immediately sort of register as something you recognize, or how much you'll want us to talk through them. If I need to give more explanation than I am right now, please unmute and just let me know. I'm happy to say a little bit more about what any of these bullet points look like. But essentially for us, contract grading means that we are doing away with all letter grades within the classroom. There are no letter grades that appear on any student work at any point in our classrooms. Within each section, faculty and students collaboratively develop a social agreement about what constitutes the work of the course. We call that the grading contract, right? That agreement emphasizes writing as a process, with a requirement that students must demonstrate robust and recursive engagement with drafting, revising, giving feedback to other students, getting feedback from other students, responding to feedback, and reflecting on the choices that they're making in their writing. So what we care about is process. We care that they think about their writing in complex and really engaged ways, not that they produce any particular thing, and certainly not that they produce something in standard written English. So for us, the doing of the work of writing in the course is what matters most. And throughout the semester, feedback from the instructor is critical. There's a lot of back and forth between students and instructors. Students get a lot of feedback from their teachers. but the feedback is always delivered in language and conversation that values the student's own goals for their writing and what the student says they want their writing to look like, not letter grades. So that is a very brief, I think, overview of what contract grading looks like in our program. So then one more passage before we really kind of get into what students are saying to us. So this is from Asawa, and he says, grading seemed to get in the way of the conversations I wanted to have with students. He means traditional grading here. It was a barrier when I would tell a multilingual student or a working class white student, for instance, that her writing was interesting and moving. Yet the C grade seemed to say something else. Grades kept us from having a real exchange. Most just wanted to follow my orders or took everything I said as an order. But I wanted them to talk through my words, think with me about their writing, and make their own decisions. And I suspect most of us have encountered an interaction with a student like that, where we really want to talk about the writing, but students in genuine and complex ways, but the students who are accustomed to letter grades know that the way to get the letter grade they want is to please the teacher. And so what they're really saying is, tell me what to do, tell me what to do. And that's a barrier to really thinking about how they want to express themselves in ways that feel authentic for the student. So we have a discussion question. We're going to do this a few times during the session today. We want to invite discussion from the entire room, from everybody here. We invite you to put things in the chat, or we hope what you'll actually do is unmute yourselves and speak a little bit. So the question we want to pose to the group for a little while now is, in what ways have you personally found traditional grading to be incompatible with language equity, or an obstacle to student learning, or a barrier to genuine conversations about writing with students?
I just have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
The question I have is, what would or where would we draw the line between acceptable professional standards and racism, put it this way, when grading?
I think that is a very big question that in some ways is beyond the scope of what we had planned to talk about today. But I think one of the ways of answering that question is to talk about that question with students directly, is to not simply say, here is the rule and it's a marker of quality and 10 points off if you violate this rule of, we could say standard English, or we could say professional, right? The expectations of a professional field. Some fields are very technical, right? Writing needs to conform in very technical ways. So rather than simply letting students see those conventions as sort of naturally and immutably right, expose them as conventions, and talk with students about the degree to which they wish to be able to code switch into those conventions, code mesh in ways that highlight tension between their own language and those conventions, and in what ways they might want to push and violate those conventions for particular purposes of their own. So I think making the very question itself a conversation for the classroom is the thing that feels most in sync with the philosophy of contract grading.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure, because I believe as an instructor, it's my job to direct my student to what's going to benefit them the most. So I just wanted some guidance. Thank you.
Heather Ramos, is your hand raised?
Yes, thank you. I just, in case, I never know if I'm supposed to use the hand function. Usually I don't do it, but I'm trying to here. Okay, I love this question that you put up, so I wanted to try to answer it. I was thinking a lot about it, and actually I think about this a lot in general, because I feel like I incorporate all the equitable grading practices I can prior to going to contract grading. So I'm like at that level. So this is really important to me. And I found a couple of things. One is the anxiety that students feel of like, I have to get that 100%, you know, not even at like, if they get they're in the A range, but they're not at 100, then there's something wrong with them, right? They feel it, they internalize it. And I'm like, no. And like some of them, it's even hard to say, right? I'm thinking about the students who, you know, come from the AP classes and they're like, no, I'm 100%, I'm a perfectionist. This is what I need to get. And that's where kind of my other struggle comes in for all students. Is the other thing is the purpose of the classroom for me, including any classroom. I've taught a bunch of different disciplines, but I am teaching in an English division right now, and writing classes primarily in literature. But it's that I want all students to learn and grow, right? They're meeting them where they're at and seeing where else I can, you know, help them on their learning journey, wherever that's going to take them. And when students come in with this obsession over grades, I feel like that can inhibit their growth mindset and like how far they can go on this learning journey. Thank you for asking that question. I love it.
I absolutely agree. I see similar things in my own classes. Students are so focused on that percentage that it's hard to talk about learning. It's hard to do learning. I see a couple other hands, Jamie and then Amanda.
My name is Jamie. I'm not currently teaching at all, but I do work at a tutoring center. And so I do see, you know, sometimes students who bring in things like, you know, prompts or rubrics from professors and things like that. And I remember in particularly, I was working with this one student and helping her write an essay. And I remember thinking that it was a pretty great essay, but when she came back, she got a B- on it. And we looked at the professor's feedback, and the only feedback she really had for her was grammar. And we didn't really see anything else wrong with the essay. And it was amazing to me that she got a B-. She basically almost got 2-letter grades down because this professor, their only feedback and based on the rubric that we saw was that the language she was using was still developing. And she was not a native speaker of English, but I have to say, even with the essay she showed me, her essay was better written than even some native speakers were. And so it kind of upset me because this professor, she got such, you know, wonderful reviews, like students love her. But I'm seeing she's using, you know, this very old, you know, style of like the students really need to learn, you know, standard English or else they're going to get a grade down. And to me, that just doesn't make sense why you would so heavily, you know, penalize someone because they are not a native speaker. And it's a dangerous idea that, you know, a non-native speaker is going to get a B-, right? Whereas other people in the class, right, if they're native English speakers, might actually get those good grades. And to me, that's really concerning in terms of equity.
Absolutely. And I imagine it was probably pretty demoralizing for the student and disheartening for the student to receive the B- grade for work they were really excited about, seemingly on the basis of grammar. In the interest of time, I see 2 more hands, Amanda and then Katie, and then we are going to move off the discussion question and move forward with the workshop.
Hi, thank you. I'm really appreciating this discussion, and I think in terms of evaluating and equitizing, I feel like I have a good sense, or at least a good growing sense of putting emphasis on voice, on thought process, minimizing emphasis on grammar, where I really find things are challenging. And I appreciated that discussion of the teacher who says, well, I don't want to do this, but the teachers you're going to have are going to need this from you. I feel a lot of pressure to teach a classic rhetorical structure to the students. And I feel like there's already an embedded aspect of policing. I think you touched on this a little bit. But when we have an academic form in mind, and then we're measuring student work against whether they can achieve that form, there's already sort of a policing aspect involved. And so I was just wondering about how contract grading might approach that whole situation and offer some alternatives.
I think in a little bit later in the session, we will have some things to say about that. So come back to that at the end. And if you feel like what we say doesn't quite get at that, and we'll take it up at the end of the session too. I think that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
And Katie, you also have your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. I actually teach human biology, and I feel like I really want to become someone that's more inclusive with language. And one area that I feel like there's a gap is with STEM type classes or science classes, because it feels a little bit more black and white with information if students know it or not. And you know, for example, a lot of my exams are multiple choice based and identify this structure, you know, and so it's harder to have, you know, grading that can take into you know, thinking about people that English is their second language and things like that. So that's just one area that I struggle with is having, you know, a different type of grading when it comes to teaching this type of class. But, you know, for example, if I'm having someone identify the bone that forms the bone on the forehead, and I put that on my test, and then, you know, I've had students that they don't know what I'm referring to when I say the word forehead. And me as a native English speaker can assume that that's something that's used all the time, but that's just, you know, all I can do at this point, or what I'm feeling is to create a space where if something on my exam doesn't make sense that they can ask me any clarification. But yeah, I would love, you know, any recommendation on how to, you know, bridge the gap when it comes to education for you know, maybe English as a second language students when it comes to like science-based learning and grading in that sense. Thank you so much.
And I mean, Willow and I are both coming from English departments, right? And so we're thinking about this and implementing this specifically in the context of first-year writing classes. I think the questions you're posing feel really important and a little bit outside my own experience range. I'd be very interested at the end of the session if there are other people in the room who would have some direct suggestions for you. Two things occur to me immediately. I think your idea of like making it okay to ask questions. I think there's a traditional test-taking culture in which no words can be spoken and no students can ask for clarification, because that is a form of I don't know, help for some students that other students don't get. But I think, of course, students should ask questions. Of course, we should clarify things for them, and making that a sort of normal standard of like procedure in your class, even during exams, feels like a good thing to do. I've been trying to remember for the past, 30 seconds where I read this. I ran into this just literally within the past 24 or 48 hours. And I cannot remember where I read it. So apologies if, apologies that I can't give you a source. If anyone knows the source, please unmute yourself and call it out. Somebody was talking about something they've started in their class. They called something like exam talking time. And whenever they passed out an exam for the first, I think I saw this on TikTok. That's where I saw this. Whenever they pass out an exam for the first 5 minutes, the students can all just talk to each other. And they think that's fine. That's part of being a classroom community. I thought it was a really interesting idea. And to avoid like thinking about that as cheating, but instead as learners working together. So I think there's a lot to move through here, but let's go to the next element of the workshop that Willow and I had been moving towards. So we also wanted to pause and consider how first-year writing courses are situated within the larger college or university. So we're specifically coming from English classes, and First-year writing on many campuses, including ours, is often understood by the broader faculty, particularly people outside the English department, as a service course that prepares students to write in their other classes. And, so we're faced with this uncomfortable situation, for us anyway, in which faculty members around campus have really strong opinions about what should or shouldn't be taught in first-year writing classes, what should or shouldn't happen in first-year writing classes. And so we hear our colleagues weighing in on whether we're doing the right thing or not in our classrooms. I vividly remember, actually, as a grad student years ago, I was standing very anonymously at an elevator, and there was a professor in not English, some other department, standing with his TA also waiting for the elevator. And I remember overhearing their conversation. And he said, with like real righteous indignation in his voice, "I don't know what they're doing in English 101 because none of my students know how to use a semicolon correctly." And I remember feeling kind of shaken by this, because like he was just convinced of the righteousness of this position he was taking. And I mean, more recently, we've come up against this in subtler ways on our current campus. I've heard buzzing from a few specific professors and departments on our campus as we have adopted contract grading for the entire first-year writing program. Heard buzzing of, well, English 101 isn't going to hold them accountable to grammar anymore, so I guess we're going to have to start teaching it ourselselves. And this is frustrating, because they're very, very sure they know what English 101 should be doing and should be teaching, but their understanding is sort of rigid and narrow, prescriptive, simplistic, and surface level, and very much in sync with standard English. So I think the next discussion question we wanted to open up was, what assumptions have you encountered from colleagues and faculty outside the field of writing studies about what first-year writing courses are supposed to teach? Now, this is obviously a question that we wrote from inside a first-year writing program, imagining that there are at least some people in the audience here who are also from first-year writing programs. So what are some of the assumptions we encounter from colleagues about what writing classes are supposed to teach students? And how might your commitment to language equity collide with those assumptions?
And while we're all thinking, I just wanted to mention that there's some great comments in the chat, and we haven't had time to talk about all of them, but please keep them coming. I'm reading them, and we also have some like general discussion time set aside at the end that we're hoping we can return to these ideas. So yeah, we're reading, we're listening.
Yeah, Melissa, go ahead.
Grammar. They always want us to basically make sure that they know how to write correct sentences grammatically so that they don't have to deal with it.
Absolutely. I feel like this is what I hear: grammar, mechanics, punctuation, all of those questions, all those issues that have a correct and incorrect format, right? Things that are not matters of, at least in standard English, judgment or style or various other ways that you could choose to craft something, but instead are simply correct or incorrect according to the conventions of standard English.
Yeah, I just want to shout out that Shannon in the chat said, perfect standard written English. Ugh. And yeah, that resonates.
And sometimes it's about formatting, right? These students don't know, after English 101, they don't know about MLA style or whatever other citation format. Therefore, English 101 should be doing that. Let's go ahead and move into some of the student data that we've brought to share with you today.
Sounds good. So let me find my notes. Okay, yeah, so we've been collecting a lot of student data since we've adopted this new curriculum. And similarly to what we're seeing in how faculty are potentially responding, especially kind of responding out of a white racial habitus, we're seeing really similar things with how potentially our students are responding. And one of the themes, this is a great segue from what we were just talking about, one of the themes we've identified from our student data is grammar and grammar instruction and how it relates to the students' understanding of language equity. you know, it's evident that even after a full semester worth of this curriculum and students really being absorbed in that curriculum, students still seem to be operating from that perspective of a white racial habitus. In information from student surveys and focus groups, students have talked about the fact that yes, EM 101 is de-emphasizing grammar and instead encouraging students to utilize their own varieties of English in their writing, but they seem to be recognizing this in very general ways. Some have said things like they like that they're not penalized, right? Or that they didn't have points taken off for grammar, for the mistakes, which is interesting too, since the contract isn't giving them individual like points or letter grades on those smaller assignments anyway. So that also reveals like a gap in their understanding of the contract, which we'll talk about later. And then others have, you know, said, oh, they're pretty satisfied in receiving feedback on grammar, but then appreciated it wasn't the most important part of their writing. So they're saying very interesting things, but none of the feedback so far has overtly framed these comments in terms of language equity or anti-racism, even though many of us might be talking about that in our classrooms with students. So that seems like they're not quite absorbing. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some quotes from some statements pulled from student data. And just wanted to quick look over those and then kind of share what we're seeing and what we're thinking. So here's one student talking about how they liked that, you know, there wasn't as much emphasis on grammar. Everyone makes mistakes. We're not penalized for our mistakes, but we are corrected if we want to be corrected. So that language there is interesting, mistake and correct. Someone else said, I think points shouldn't be taken off. Students shouldn't be penalized for the errors. Just point them out, don't impact the grade. Someone else said, I feel like if the professor was able to check our grammar, it would have been better, but there's other resources. I think she was referencing maybe like a writing center. So if we needed to know if something was right or wrong, we could use those as much as we could. And here we can see that students are discussing grammar primarily in terms of what I was saying before, mistakes, being penalized, traditional grading, right and wrong. They might struggle in part to talk about writing outside of the language of standard written English conventions, kind of in the same ways that other faculty members might struggle, because that's what they understand writing to be, right? Like grammar, mechanics, punctuation. And so there's just a interesting like microcosm of this that happened in my own class. In the pilot version of this new curriculum, my class didn't really spend a lot of time talking about grammar, and I didn't really comment much on it. I wasn't intending to ignore it, but we just ended up focusing on other things. And I asked students to write reflections on the different pieces of writing that they wrote and talk about their writing process. What did you do? What did you change? How did you take feedback into account? And it was really fascinating because so many of them mentioned something about feedback they got from me on their grammar. And then they went ahead and fixed those mistakes. Like their perception of what happened was somehow grammar was in the mix, even if I hadn't commented on it at all. And so they don't really have the vocabulary to talk about writing outside of grammar. So that to me really struck me how difficult it is to break free from equating the conventions of standard written English with desirable language use. If we go to the next slide, we can also see just a couple other things that I think relate to what Rachel was describing about the kind of proxy racism that Dr. Vey called out. One student was talking about peer review and how in their peer review sessions with their classmates, they weren't supposed to really focus on grammar. Instead, they were going to focus on content. And she said that, oh no, please don't go into the next semester writing essays like this, I guess her classmates' essays, because that's not going to slide, I promise. And then another student talked about how in a similar way, this might give students the wrong mindset about what not focusing on grammar means. So some of that bolded material there. Okay, I'm not going to have good grammar, but even if I don't, it's okay because I didn't get penalized for it. That event of losing points creates this kind of like image in your head where it's like, okay, I need to be more disciplined about grammar because I know from experience I'll lose points and it's a bad reflection. It's not what I want. Though I do think the intent was positive. So both of those students, I think, are really speaking from that white racial habitus. It's really hard to break free from. I think we can see how the conditioning over many years for students has really reinforced the notion of standard written English as the best standard. And even when decentering grammar was presented by many of us as a pedagogical choice motivated by anti-racism, students will still assume that that is standard written English is appropriate, or that the punitive side of grading grammar is somehow good or bad. This reveals to me that they aren't necessarily critically questioning what those standards are rooted in and making us think of how we can contextualize this better in a larger framework, whether it's academic or professional, that might have some troubling implications, like normalizing only white ways of speaking and writing as better or more appropriate. So just a couple things that I've been doing in kind of response to this is trying to find readings to center in our class so that we can come up with discussion opportunities to really center language equity issues. And so one of the things I've assigned for my students is Dr. Vey's Now We Straight, talk about code switching and code meshing, and like have a discussion, have students write some responses to that, and maybe share personal experiences if they're comfortable. And we also read Amy Tan's Mother Tongue, which I've used for many years in the previous curriculum. But what I find interesting, and Rachel and I have been talking about this a couple times this past year with the new curriculum, students now seem better able to recognize language equity issues. If any of you are familiar with that piece, the writer is talking a lot about how her mother was judged for broken English. And my students now seem better equipped to like point out, oh, that's a racist stigma, or that's a stereotype, or that's a microaggression, that's a problem with language equity. And so those kinds of readings have made space for me to guide students towards framing the work that we're doing at our institution, especially talking about language and grammar as existing within a larger framework of language equity. Which leads me to our next discussion question. We're very curious to hear from others. I just mentioned some readings I'm thinking about centering. What is the role of grammar or grammar instruction within a curriculum concerned with language equity? How do we talk about it? How do we teach it? What space do we make for it? So we'd love to hear some insights from our audience.
I think is a tough one. And I apologize that the sun is on me. It's 6:30 p.m. here in Philadelphia, and I don't usually take meetings in this room, and I didn't realize the sun was going to be right on my chair. I think one of the things that we've talked about and that other members of our first year writing faculty have talked about as we've all kind of grappled with this is to talk about power, right? To talk about the ways in which power structures of our society demand standard written English in certain circumstances, and what the choices we have in pushing back on that power are, what the choices we have for self-protection in relation to that power are, but to frame it as power, not the right way to talk, not speaking correctly and not making mistakes, but to frame it as power. And if students want grammar instruction, we're not going to say, I will not tell you how to use a semicolon. No, won't do it. If a student is saying, please tell me how to use a semicolon, we're happy to do that. But we also want to make sure we're framing it in terms of language equity issues, that this is one variety of English. It's not a superior variety. It's not the only variety. It's one that's aligned with power in our culture. And that means a lot of things, right? In terms of access that you have to opportunities and resources, but it's power. Don't mistake it for something else. Ahmed, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that sometimes you forget the basic common sense. Language is all about communication. So the role of grammar for me is to be able to teach them to communicate. And if they communicate, then they have achieved the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not about, following rigid grammatical rules. That's the way I look at it. And this is, a way I think it's language equity. As long as I can communicate, in any other form, then we have achieved the purpose. But we teach them a grammar to communicate.
And I think the issue of communication is so important. Is the message the student wants to convey getting through? Do you know what the student means? And our answer to that is often, yes, of course I know what the student means. When we conference with students, we're often kind of negotiating that. We say, when I read this as a reader, I think that you're pointing towards this and that. Is that what you mean? And sometimes the student says, no, that's not what I meant at all. That's not what I wanted you to take away from this. And so then we have a conversation. Well, what is the thing that you want your reader to understand? And we try to get as close to what the student wants to convey as possible. But I think communication is a good way to think about it.
Wanted to just give a shout out to a couple things in the comments, the chat box. Catherine McMurray saying, emphasizing grammar tools, not grammar rules, and goes on to give lovely examples of that. And Clara mentions contextualized grammar, which I think is probably pretty similar to what you were just describing, Rachel, right? Like not just delivering these rules out of context with power and the history of them. And, even acknowledging, as we're talking about this, I often with my students will try to point out just like the kind of classist, elitist rules that govern English that really don't need to be there. And the idea that the rules that they're quick to accept, have a history behind them and a context that they might not be familiar with. So just ways in talking about it, but not just leaving it there and perpetuating this idea that, oh, well, grammar means this. And if you don't use it this way, there's something lacking or inferior, going down that line of thinking. And Shannon's posing a question in the chat, like, when did the rule get put in place, by whom and why? Whom does it benefit? Like, actually interrogating grammar a little bit, if there's space to do that.
And I see what Shannon had put in the previous comment before the question, highlighting that language is always changing, right? Mm-hmm. Language rules are however people use language. That's what becomes the rules. It's not a sort of pre-existing set of correctness. Language is how it is used. And highlighting some of those changes can be pretty powerful as well. So I want to talk about a second theme of feedback that we saw in some of our student responses. So this theme that I'm about to address is student feedback that is helping us see areas where our faculty probably need to make adjustments in how we're implementing contract grading, how we're communicating with students about it, how we're explaining it to students. And one of the things that I think you find out as soon as you begin to implement certainly contract grading, but probably other forms of alternative grading, alternative assessment as well, is that it requires a different skill set than traditional grading. It requires a very different skill set from us as instructors than traditional grading does. In fact, one of our faculty members said to me just 1 or 2 days ago this week, she said, actually contract grading has been a little bit demoralizing for me because I feel like I'm a first-year teacher again. I feel like I'm not quite sure how to do it and I'm getting it wrong in all kinds of ways. I'm not feeling competent, utterly competent the way, I did in a traditional grading system that I'd been accustomed to for 30 years. So this is a really, veteran teacher who is experiencing the disorientation of implementing a new skill set as an instructor. So we're not surprised to see this theme of student comments that are showing us ways that we need to adjust and shift and get better at the new skill set that contract grading requires of us. So in the screen or the student comments you're seeing right now, the first one, so these are both about negotiating the contract, right? So the grading contract is built collaboratively between students and the instructor at the beginning of the semester. And our recommendation to our instructors is that they revisit the contract several times and ask for student input and negotiate together what should be an element of it during the first 2 weeks. So the first comment here I think is really interesting, right? The student says deciding the contents of the grading contract as a class should take more than one class period. One of the things I see in this comment is that the student recognizes that this is both important and complex to engage in determining what the parameters of doing the course, succeeding in the course, progressing in the course are, and feel shortchanged when not enough time was spent on it, right? And then the second comment, there was one class we had where we actually looked at the outlining of contract grading and worksheet, and the professor asked us to come up with at least like 2 ideas. But then we had a few ideas. We discussed them with the professor, and he'll be like, okay, I really like this. I'll add it to the list. But they weren't added. I don't know if we'd consider this a miscommunication or like him forgetting, but I would hope to see that something we would like was actually put into the contract grading. So one of the things I see here is the sense that students are taking us seriously when we say, we value your input. We want you to be a part of this. We want you to collaboratively build this grading contract with us. Students are taking us at our word, and we need to live up to our word, right? We need to walk the walk. If we say that we value their input, we need to make sure that it actually appears in the contract, right? So the next theme. These are some comments that we got from students about grading, about their anxiety associated with not having grades, which is, I think, really interesting. So the first student here says, in theory, I believe contract grading is a good idea, and it lays out proper guidelines for our expectations in class. However, I feel that not being able to physically see how I'm doing in the class from the instructor's perspective was counterproductive. There were a number of times when I was on the phone with my mom, and she asked how I was doing in my English class, and I literally couldn't give an answer because I had no number grade to go off of. I could have said I theoretically had a B, but even then I wasn't sure if that was an accurate response. And then the next student says something similar. I used to use point grades as a measurement of how well I'm doing. So not having that kind of threw me off. I also don't know what my current grade would be because Canvas, that's the LMS we use. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with Canvas, but because Canvas doesn't give us any letter or the like. And so this was a really common theme actually in student feedback, anxiety around not knowing what their grade was. And in some ways, this is a really frustrating response to me because, you know, as Willow has already mentioned, students' attachments to grades, I'd even say their obsession with grades, is partially the product of how fully their K through 12 educations have been saturated with the assumptions and beliefs of a white racial habitus. I think it's also a trust issue. When we ask students to journey through English 101 with us using contract grading, we're placing a lot of trust in each other. We're asking the students to trust us. We are trusting them that they'll engage in good faith and put in the work. And students are trusting us that this isn't somehow a trick. In fact, I think a lot of student discomfort with contract grading is rooted in the fear that there's a trick somewhere here, that they're not seeing yet, but that it's going to get them. And this kind of breaks my heart because it says something about how they've been socialized in the classroom and how to understand what happens in a classroom. And so I think when they say, I'm not sure what my grade is, they're worried that what they believe to be true isn't actually true, right? And what the contract says isn't actually going to be true. And the reality is that the student, either of these students here, should be able to calculate exactly where they currently stand with regard to the contract at any moment in the semester. It's from, you know, the instructor's perspective, like not true that they don't know how they're doing, that they can't look it up, that they can't calculate it. They just need to look at a record of their work. What have they completed? What have they submitted on time? What have they submitted late? What have they not submitted? Have they missed any writing conferences with the instructor or a writing center tutor? Like these are just facts, and totaling them up with some simple fact or some simple math tells the student exactly where they currently stand. And yet, despite my impulse to say, of course, you know your grade, you can calculate it, right? Despite that being my impulse. and my fervent belief that contract grading is a more equitable system. The reality is that students may feel unsure and vulnerable trying to work inside a system that is profoundly unfamiliar to them, right? In which all the rules they've worked hard to internalize in high school suddenly don't seem to provide traction or a sense of orientation. How do I know how I'm doing, right? And I think the lesson here for anyone interested in implementing contract grading is that if we intend to liberate students from inequitable letter grades that privilege white racial habitus and who is best able to perform that in standard written English, then we need to spend some real class time actively teaching students how to see and understand their progress in ways that exist outside the traditional grading system. We can't just assume that it'll be self-evident to them. It's not self-evident to them. They've been trained for many years to understand that they're making progress if they got a C on the first paper and a B on the second paper. And now we've removed those C's and B's, we've removed those signposts. And so we need to teach them new methods of wayfinding. So the next discussion question we have for the room is, what could that look like? How might an instructor communicate progress to a student outside the system of traditional grades? What other resources do we have at our disposal to do this?
In the chat, we have a comment from Catherine about using Nancy Summers' writing about reflection. I use reflection assignments to help students self-assess their progress. That's awesome. I think a while back in the chat, it would take me maybe a little bit longer to scroll. Someone mentioned something about like the dialogic method, like talking and conferencing. And if I'm misrepresenting this, that person can correct me in the chat. But like that dialogue method with students being really helpful to communicate that progress without a letter grade.
Yeah, and I'm also seeing in the chat about, could we have contract grading benchmarks in Canvas so that the best of both worlds could be available? And this, I think, is one of the answers I personally have come up with. All of the things that a student does need to understand where they stand in the contract, that actually is in Canvas, but it's not a percentage, right? And so teaching students how to read those benchmarks in Canvas, I've realized, is really important for myself. And it's also important for me to make class time available for doing exactly that. I mean, I think there are a number of other things that we do to tell students how they're progressing all the time, whether or not we think about them as sort of formal modes of communication, like written feedback. When we write feedback on a paper, that's letting students know how they're progressing. And I think that being more direct in terms of articulating progress over the course of multiple papers, over the course of multiple assignments, over the course of the semester is something that's really important when you are giving written feedback in a contract grading system. I've discovered it's really important to say things like, in this paper, I see that you did blah, 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 which is something that you've been talking about in your reflections that you wanted to focus on. I see that you're doing it in a way that you weren't able to do in your first paper, and that looks like progress to me, right? I see you making progress towards the goals you've set for yourself as a writer in this class, like directly saying that in our feedback, rather than just leaving students to figure out on their own that they must be making progress if they got a B on the first paper and an A on the second paper or whatever. Ahmed, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just want to share that in my class, I also share with my students Padlet, with halfway through the semester, we stop and we do some retrospectives and some reflection. What went right? What went wrong? How can we improve the second half of the semester? And I let them, and put their comments as anonymous, so they are free to share their experience. And also, we revisit those later on, just 3 weeks before the semester end, to see, are we on track? How are we doing with those with this feedback? Just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great practice, and one that encourages students to understand themselves as participants in thinking about what progress looks like and like assessing their own progress. I am going to drop into the chat right now a link to, I guess you could call it a worksheet, a chart, a handout I literally give my students that invites them to check in on their progress in all kinds of ways. Well, in 3 ways in particular in my class. One is, here's how to calculate your grade, the grade that you are on track to receive for the at the end of the semester. And so you'll see on page 2, it has the chart from our contract, the contract that the students have developed with me. The chart is excerpted from the contract. The whole contract is, of course, more involved. And then I have blanks for the students to look in Canvas and fill in. How many absences do you have? Have you missed any conferences? Have you missed or been late with assignments? And things like that, so that they can literally calculate their grade. Have you taken the Life Happens adjustment? How do you feel about where you're currently sitting in our chart? If you would like to be aiming for, contracting for a higher grade than the one you're currently sitting at, what are the actions you can take so that they can create a goal for themselves and a plan, an action plan? And then there are 2 more self check-ins, one about complete work. That's one of the metrics that we use for students. When they submit things, is it complete? And we've defined completeness together as a class. So the sort of rubric looking thing you see here is something the students and I designed together to determine what is complete work and what is work that I will give back to the student and say, hey, keep working on this until it meets the threshold of completion. And then the last one is an active participation check-in. And so this too, the rubric looking thing that you see here is collaboratively developed between the students and me. This is what we have together decided active participation in the class is. And so I literally make some class time to 10 or 15 minutes, a couple times during the semester, for us all to sit down with these sheets and students to just kind of check in with how they're doing. And I think this is really valuable for students to get a sense of what kind of progress they're making and what kind of engagement they're having with the class. Willow, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. I'm aware of the little countdown clock and that we have 10 minutes. So I'm going to do the 5-minute version of this and not the 10-minute version, so we can chat more at the end. So if we go to the next slide, we want to show just real quick some data. Despite all those challenges we were just talking about, we also do have some, I think, pretty convincing responses from students that the contract was beneficial to them and that they could see it helping them move outside of a lot of the constraints of the traditional grading system. So this was one survey we gave, and you can see that the thumbs up to contract grading was the highest score there, or whatever you'd call that. In other words, they seem to have generally positive or at worst neutral feelings, and then a small number did the thumbs down. But they seem to value a few things. So I want to really quickly just give an overview of what did they value about it. So the first set of responses are mostly talking about kind of its flexibility and customization. So we can see some bolded statements there, like instead of the professor demanding, they put it in our hands, right? The shape of the contract, the shape of the course. It was more malleable because it was on the student's terms. I really liked this third statement. I would explain it to others, the contract, by simply saying, just get your things done and you pass. That's literally how it was. You have a space to set your grade to your satisfaction. I think the contract was a little more complex than that, but I also love that this student said, you know, this is great, it should be normalized. Like, it seemed as though this student felt that the contract made a lot of sense to them. Go to the next slide. this is a little smaller, but just a few phrases that stood out to me. This is more about like reducing stress and how students like had an emotionally positive feeling about it. The student at the top said, I was able to manage my schedule better. I didn't have to worry about the grade as much. Another student said it was not as stressful as getting a grade. Contract grading removed a lot of the stress. As long as I completed the assignment, I would get the grade. Another student said I was never scared about my final product. I knew I could think everything through and still not have a horrible grade if I worded something slightly wrong. And there were a couple other statements I didn't put on the slide because there was not room, but along the lines of, I didn't feel the pressure to be perfect in my writings, right? That notion that at some point they were feeling that they had to be perfect, and this alleviated that stress. Go to the next slide. The next set of comments seem to be focusing on the collaborative nature of the contract and how they appreciated that. So students would create the rules and collaborate with the teacher. Set of qualifications that the student agrees to. It's a conversation to set expectations. You really get to have an open-ended conversation with the professor. The flexibility is there, so we can see the kind of co-constructing side of it as valuable to students. And then the last slide of student experiences. This to me was really interesting. This seems to focus more on sort of students' positionality within the classroom and realizing that the contract can decenter the professor as like the authority. And I think that was really interesting that students were able to talk about this, even if they weren't fully conscious that like that's what they're saying, although I think some of them might have been. One person said, when you put a number or grade on someone's voice and style, it feels like you need to change how you write per teacher. So recognizing that there's not always continuity even between what writing instructors are grading and asking for. Another student said it allowed us to tell the teacher what seemed unfair in the contract. Oftentimes in classes, we have to listen to whatever a teacher says, no matter how unfair. The contract being open and up to discussion let us point out what seemed unreasonable for grading and take out things that would negatively affect our learning experience. Another student said, I got to express what I wanted, how I wanted, without trying to do as the teacher wants. So from these examples, it seems evident that students were in this situation a little bit better able to explain a connection between the contract grading system and their own agency as writers. They were articulating both the positive consequences of working with the instructor to co-construct the class and the adverse effects of positionality within a classroom, having the professor as the sole arbiter of what constitutes quality or A work, or how grades can interfere with the learning experience rather than enhancing it. They've noted how it can demoralize them or push them to conform to what the teacher wants, which in turn perpetuates often that white racial habitus of standard written English. So they might not be thinking in terms of, oh, this is decolonizing the classroom, but that's kind of what they're seeing in the potential of the contract. So in other words, I think students in these comments all throughout our presentation, and especially in this section, I think they're saying articulating really great points, but they're maybe like one step short of seeing how that truly fits into a language equity framework. So to me, this means we need to help them to take that next conceptual step and repeatedly reinforce the language equity framework of the contract. And I would just kind of briefly say, I think this is great in terms of like, we can appeal to these student values when we're negotiating a contract or using one and like get their buy-in. And I don't mean that in a manipulative way, like get their buy-in, but I think we can take this information as instructors and say, oh, that's awesome. Like that's what students want, and we can help provide that for them. I had a little bit more to say, but I think I'm gonna just like stop there. We've got about 4 minutes, and maybe we can turn the conversation over to the rest of the group and see what we want to chat about. And Rachel also posted another handout in the chat, some questions that might help you if you're thinking about adopting contract grading. And these questions help you to focus on the big picture as well as like the logistics of what the contract is.
And Jacqueline has patiently had a hand up for a long time. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question about, communicating the progress in the class. And I was just trying to find, okay, so the grade check-in, I'm just wondering, what if a student, say, for example, had, not quite the exact numbers in all of the categories? Like, how would they be able to figure out, which grade they would have?
So
so
you're saying if it's not a horizontally straight line, if it's sort of jagged?
Yeah.
So different faculty set that differently. In my class, it is wherever you have, how to say this, wherever your lowest two sit, that's where you sit. So if 2 columns fall to the C level, you're at a C. And there are plenty of ways for students to boost that back up. It's not just a hole they're in that they can never get out of. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a column called Dimensions of Engagement. There are a bunch of different things that they can do in there that will help boost them back up. And they're all about engaging with their own writing that they've already been doing in new ways, reflecting on it, meeting with me and talking about it, talking with someone in the writing center about it. They're all about kind of metacognitive relationships to their writing.
Okay.
I tried to answer really quickly because the clock is going. I don't know if that was a satisfying answer.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I could ask some other questions too, if no one else has any.
That would be great.
We have 56 seconds before we're all kicked out of the breakout room, it looks like. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm wondering if you feel like students are able to kind of work the system and get away with kind of doing the bare minimum, but still getting a, quote unquote, good grade, if you ever have that feeling.
Willow, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think the short answer is, yeah, I think some students can or will or have in my class. I think there are ways, maybe beyond what we have in 15 seconds, to like help address or mitigate that. I think how I'm reckoning with it personally is that I think there have been ways for my students in a traditional curriculum and traditional grading to do that as well. We have 3 seconds. We'd love to chat more.